Hey, this is Doug from Homes Now, Not Later. I just wanted to share a few updates. Unity Village and Swift Haven, the first two tiny home communities to exist in Bellingham, with the goal of ending homelessness one person at a time. Both villages continue to run smoothly and safely. Swift Haven was able to get online in only 2 weeks because the county, city, and Homes Now work together where appropriate to achieve a concrete and achievable goal in a very short period of time. It can be done again if it's important to the city or the county to move quickly to house people. Recently, we have been painting the houses at Swift Haven. Residents were largely given free rein to paint the tiny homes to their preference, and we've ended up with a lot of unique and interesting designs. Each tiny home unit is the same design, so being able to paint them creates a sense of ownership and uniqueness in one's unit. As has been mentioned recently by the city, a new village will be set up by the Low Income Housing Institute, LIHI, and Road to Home, called Gardenview Village. The village is managed by LIHI, and Road to Home is estimated to cost anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million a year to operate. The main reason for this cost involves having 24/7 paid staff to act as case managers for individual residents, 7 staff members to start. By contrast, the 2 current tiny home villages managed by Homes Now, the first 2 tiny home communities to exist in Bellingham, cost around $18,000 a year to operate for Unity Village because of utility costs, and around $0 a year to operate at Swift Haven because we do not have to pay the utility costs on that site. The main reason for such a difference in costs is that the villages managed by Homes Now are resident managed. In other words, the people who live at the village are the people who manage and run the village. Homes Now has around a 45% rehousing rate at this time and rising. This is in the absence of having any paid staff and $0 needed for paid staff. This number includes around 70 people who have come through our program since we set up our first tent encampment in early 2019. That rate is higher if only counting the time where we have been operating tiny homes instead of tents. Our system continues to improve over time with practice and experience. A majority of the residents of both villages were previously camping or living in their vehicles as opposed to staying at the shelters. Campers tend to be independent in general, and our model allows them to keep their autonomy and work together with other residents to improve everybody's situation together while reducing the number of tents seen around town as a result. Our ability to scale up quickly is only limited by having available land to set up on and residents from previous villages that want to help manage a new site. According to our current permits, residents can only become managers after they have been living with us for 6 months or more. If that time frame was reduced to, say, 3 months, we'd be able to move even faster. As for our preferred management structure, we prefer to have at least 3 managers to a site, each with equal standing. This creates a basic system of checks and balances in which a point of contact is always available on site, but preventing a situation in which one manager or one person can override the voices of the other residents. We have found it to work quite well. When people finally find more long-term housing, they're going to need to be independent and work with others, similar to an atmosphere that we have at Unity Village and Swift Haven, in which not only do residents work together, but they can easily get linked up with services and other organizations who can provide help in various areas where appropriate. We are open to the public, and we welcome anybody from any agency to check it out, visit, and help our residents where needed. Multiple people already have. You know who you are, and thank you. That brings me to our next subject. The City of Bellingham in recent weeks announced that in response to their request for qualifications, that they would be selecting LIHI to partner with in regards to a tiny home village for the City of Bellingham. As this process has begun to move forward, comparisons have been drawn between LIHI and Homes Now, the different models we use. I'd like to address some arguments and comparisons made about our organization and the concept of tiny home villages in general. At the last City of Bellingham Committee of the Whole meeting, Tara Sundin, Economic Development Manager for the City of Bellingham, made the argument that tiny homes are not housing.
This will be a quick one. As you recall, we issued a request for qualifications last fall for a tiny home encampment, and we selected a partnership with the Low Income Housing Institute. I refer to it as LIHI, and our local new nonprofit called Road to Home. They've partnered up. LIHI has an amazing amount of experience. They operate over 2,000 housing units in addition to about 13 tiny home villages. And these are villages that are fully staffed. They come with case management. And so the model is really focused on getting people, because tiny home encampments are shelter. I want to make that very clear with the council. I think you know that, but maybe for others tuning in, tiny home encampments are not housing.
In terms of a city or local government being eligible for funds or having to define housing or shelter a certain way, I understand that. But I would like to counter that tiny homes are definitely housing as well as shelter. The basic definition of housing is any shelter, lodging, or dwelling place, a place where people live. A tiny home is very basic, but also fits into the general definition of housing. If you have your own unit and your own privacy, it's very different than sleeping at a congregate shelter in a big room of 150 people where you don't have your own place or privacy, where you have to leave during certain parts of the day. It provides a temporary spot to lay your head when it's cold, but that will not get people out of survival mode, no matter how good the shelter is. By contrast, tiny homes do get people out of survival mode, which makes it easier for them to move forward. In the past, the city of Bellingham has referred to HomesNOW as a transitional housing program, and now we're being defined as an emergency shelter and not housing. You can't have it both ways, where you define what we're doing as not housing while at the same time calling us a transitional housing program. The reality is that what HomesNOW provides is very basic emergency housing, and it is transitional as well. Later in the meeting, City Council member Pinky Vargas commented that $1 million for a temporary shelter was a lot of money, and that the price tag for HomesNOW was not anywhere near that amount to set up Unity Village in Swifthaven. Planning Director Rick Sepler then mentioned that the city is funding the track record of LIHI in terms of being able to place.
And I'm also $1 million for shelters is a lot of money. Considering this is going to be the third one that we've brought into the city, but the others were done by HomesNOW, and I don't think they had anywhere near that price tag. So I know that this is important, but I'm struggling with spending $1 million of our dollars on this for something that's temporary. And I'll just leave it at that. Maybe.
Yeah, I'd like to start on that, and I'll ask Tara to chime in if I miss a point. First, what we're actually funding here is the track record of an organization that places 57% of its residents within a year, and also provides a place for somewhere between 35 and 50 plus or minus folks to live during that period of time, with, I should say, very little adverse effect on surrounding neighborhoods and their other developments. Secondly, HomesNOW isn't free. I recall that Swifthaven probably is closer to $200,000 in municipal expense to be established. Between the provision of the tiny homes and the site improvements and the in-kind work that's done, they're not specifically a no-cost option. So that's not a fair comparison. Similarly, HomesNOW does not provide on-site case management. And case management is vital to get the higher placement rate. Now, I don't want to dispute and compare them because they're a different kind of program. And again, we might have a different performance standard that's met by HomesNOW over time.
The planning director said that it was around $200,000 to set up Swifthaven, our second tiny home village. He made note of the provision of the tiny homes, site improvements, and in-kind work that's done, such as the work that has been done by city employees working for Public Works. The planning director seems to be counting the costs of the regular wages of Public Works employees to set up the infrastructure for the site in terms of that estimation of $200,000. Although these workers would be paid either way, whether they were doing this task or another task. Also, the structures were paid for by the county through emergency COVID dollars. This means that the city did not have to pay for the tiny home structures. Also, the planning director left out the part about operations costs, of which HomesNOW villages have $0 in operating costs, since we have residents acting in a staff capacity at our villages. The people who live there are the people who run it. The planning director also mentioned that HomesNOW does not have on-site case management. This is not necessarily the case. HomesNOW does not have 24/7 case management on site employed by us. But when services or options are needed, we work with any service provider who will work with us to help residents in the housing or services they might need. We have made headway through a variety of sources. Case management is handled with an on-demand basis. This allows us to remain flexible in helping find services without overburdening the taxpayers or inefficiently managing our time by having to have 24/7 on-site case management. It's simply easier to have somebody available on demand with regular visits. A resident gives you a call, you get down there, rather than being down there all the time when nothing is going on. It's much more efficient and practical to do it this way as well, because any caseworker could handle multiple sites at once or help other agencies with the same services if the service doesn't have to do directly with housing. I want to make it clear, though, that HomesNOW is surgically focused on the housing part. And yes, a tiny house is housing. We make sure people have a stable place to live while they move forward and find long-term housing. Our current rehousing rate is somewhere around 45%. Around 70 people have come through our program since January of 2019, not including the people who currently live at the villages. I can't stress enough that we're focused on the housing part. Is an apartment complex expected to manage the mental health or social services of the tenants who live there? Or are they simply expected to provide a stable apartment complex where the tenants are not disrupting each other or the property or the surrounding neighborhood? Because we provide housing for people who are homeless, we are held to a stricter standard in terms of being expected to fix people's personal problems for them in their lives regarding mental health or addictions or other areas. I only have to say that those areas are very important, but they are areas that are separate to housing, and they are areas we typically refer to as services, which always seem to be in short supply. And they are areas which don't apply to every individual or everybody's situation. Everybody's situation is different. As a result, organizations who help with a technical goal such as housing are being asked to take on the burden of the lack of services and provide those services themselves. Not every person needs help for addictions or mental illness. Sometimes when it comes to homelessness, it's just that a fair number of people are operating on stereotypes or assumptions that might not be looking at the bigger picture, or that they see the entire homeless population as the 10% or so who might be causing the most issues. Later in the meeting, Economic Development Manager Tara Sundin said that the price tag of $500,000 to $1 million is what it costs to safely manage a shelter.
I just wanted to mention that you're right, Pinky, it is expensive. And as we're talking about shelters and a lot of discussion about that this year, this dollar figure is about what we've been, both Rick and I have been quoting for a couple of years. It is what it costs to operate a shelter. Whether it's for my dog, whether it's for, 25 people or 50 or 75, it really is what it takes to safely operate something like this. And case management is so important.
She also mentioned that case management is important to achieve that. I totally disagree with her assessment, because HomesNOW is already managing and operating something like that, and it is a fraction of the cost, and it is safe. Unity Village costs around $18,000 a year to operate, and Swift Haven has a cost of near zero to operate. And yes, both are safe. Planning Director Rick Sepler mentioned that spending $1 million on this village was the most prudent option that could be offered to the City Council. If we're getting a rehousing rate of 45% so far, without 24/7 on-site case management and at a cost of near zero for operations, and LIHI is able to achieve 57% at $1 million, then perhaps it may have been more prudent to set up multiple sites with a resident-managed approach so that greater numbers of people could have been helped with a smaller drain on the taxpayers. If LIHI is granted a second village in the future, those costs would double. This would obviously lead to a situation where taxes would have to be increased to pay for it. The city is currently discussing a possible sales tax or property tax increase to pay for this, but this will drive up the price of housing further over time, thus potentially making homelessness worse in the long run. That's just my thoughts on it anyway. Later in the meeting, Councilmember Michael Lilliquist made the argument that because the intensive case management model implemented by LIHI is there, that he was willing to sign off on it because when using that model, there is maximum throughput, and once somebody finds housing, a tiny home opens up for somebody else who needs it.
Well, I'm really glad that Pinky brought up the cost issue, because we always have to think about that. But I'm supportive in large part because this tiny home village has a heavy component for services and case management on site. I've been looking into best practices for shelters, and the easy way to sum that up is the most effective shelters are the ones who focus on getting people into housing. They're the ones that maximize throughput. So if it works out well, it won't be 35 tiny homes with people in them. It'll be the same 35 homes serving different people.
I agree with Michael about the fact that when somebody finds housing, it opens up a tiny home for somebody else who needs it. And the same 30 or so structures can get multiple people into housing, and it's not just providing housing for 30 people without them moving on. I've been saying this for years at city council meetings and workshop meetings, calling it an engine to get people into housing. He implied, though, that because we don't have that intensive case management approach, that people don't move on, and this is simply not the case. Since we've been in operation with our first tent encampment in 2019, we've seen 70 people come through our program, and 45% have found long-term housing as a result, and rising. The throughput might not be higher than a theoretical maximum of LIHI with their much larger resource pool, but we still have a good rate, and it's at a fraction of the cost, meaning we have a better bang for buck ratio when it comes to getting people into housing. Also, I'd like to make a few arguments myself that were not mentioned in any of the meetings. Typically, it is presented that moving people into what is referred to as permanent housing is always the best result for that person. That may not always be the case. For example, let's say that you're on disability or on a fixed income and you're only bringing in $700 a month. If you are able to obtain that long-term housing, automatically around 30% of that $700 is taken out for rent in accordance with HUD definitions for fair rate of rent. That leaves you with $490. Then after that point, you need to pay all your bills yourself, as well as all your own expenses for food and other stuff. This leaves you with very little money, and realistically is not enough to live on for most people, even if you get that place. By contrast, at a tiny home village, that monthly cost might be zero or near zero, and suddenly that $700 goes a lot further than it did under a so-called permanent scenario. Also, because of community support in a village environment, many donations of food, supplies, other goods are delivered directly to the front gate, and because of regular community involvement at the site, residents get connected with more opportunities such as jobs or other services they might not be aware of. Also, there is a sense of community and people helping other people. You don't typically have that in an apartment complex. In the past, we have seen a few instances of a resident finding housing, but when removed from the community setting, they go off track again. Some people thrive in a community living situation. Others would rather be alone in managing their own affairs. As for myself, I fall somewhere in the middle. I could do well in a community living, but I also do well alone. I enjoy both. Tiny house living is not an inferior level of housing, though. It's just different, and it works well for some people and not as well for others, depending on who they are. It's just another option. I do think something akin to a $0 rent option should always be available to people. Of course, it would be basic housing like what we have, but it should be one option of many. Another argument I'd like to make is that sometimes the housing which is offered long-term might be worse than living at a tiny home village. For example, if you were offered a motel room long-term in a high-crime or high-drug use area, it might be a decreased standard of living compared to a tiny home village. Some of our residents in the past have been offered housing which to them feels like a downgrade from a tiny home village. Also, if there are not enough units for long-term housing for people, which the city and other agencies have mentioned for years, then it doesn't matter how intensive the casework is. There's simply not enough slots available for people, and it's not their fault. We hear every year that enough units will come online in the next year or two, but it never seems to materialize fast enough. Of course, everybody would like to have their own place and larger than a tiny home, but until a whole bunch of affordable housing units have come online far below market rate, then what is deemed a temporary option, such as a tiny home village, ends up becoming more long-term, as it has for some people. Also, resident staff duties such as site manager can be on a resume and help residents find meaningful work later to get out of poverty. It also provides a sense of ownership and a stake in the operations and policies of the village. There was also, in addition to this committee of the whole meeting, there was also a community meeting done Thursday night from LIHI and Road to Home. I would like to address some statements that were made in the meeting as well. In the meeting, Tara Sundin and Melissa Bird described the application process for Road to Home and mentioned that Road to Home will be using the coordinated entry system to accept new applicants from the Homeless Service Center. Sundin mentioned that it was required.
So one of the things when the city of Bellingham is involved in funding agencies, we require that they work through the communities. This is a county-wide homeless service center. It's housed at the Opportunity Council, and they are, so to speak, a one-stop shop. And that's where we're looking for LIHI to find people that are good fits for this village, right? But also, how do we, they're also going to be working on getting people from this village into housing, okay?
I can speak to that. We will be taking referrals from the Whatcom Homeless Service Center using the coordinated entry system. We are in discussions with other agencies trying to figure out if we could still take maybe a small percentage of other referrals or referrals from other agencies, such as Lighthouse Mission. Could Road to Home refer some of their clients they've been working with thus far to LIHI for this program? And all those details are still being worked out.
In previous meetings with the planning department, planning director Rick Suppler also mentioned to me that participation in the coordinated entry system might be required in the future for HomesNOW as well. At the time it was mentioned, I didn't know what it was. I was told that it was a referral system. I was not against the concept at all of getting referrals to our organization from other sources other than our own website or paper forms. I was referred to Terry Bryant from the Opportunity Council to find out more about enrollment in the program and the conditions associated with it. In an email exchange, I mentioned that HomesNOW was going to be applying to the city's RFQ. We were informed in the future the city would likely require us to join the coordinated entry process, and was wondering what that would entail. In this email exchange, I asked if we were to become part of the coordinated entry system, would we still be allowed to intake people with our own system? I asked if having our own process as well in parallel without asking for any kind of direct funding from the city or county was okay. Terry Bryant informed me that the system isn't designed to run in parallel. It's meant to ease the burden on homeless households so they don't need to be engaging in multiple wait lists. She mentioned that what we're trying to do did not fall in line with best practices. She advised me to look over the coordinated entry core elements provided by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, so that I could understand more about how it worked. What was quoted in terms of provider concerns is as follows. Understandably, some housing and supportive service providers express concern about relinquishing control of referral to and enrollment in their programs as coordinated entry shifts from a project-centric focus to a person-centric approach. Before coordinated entry, a provider usually makes decisions about which people to enroll in its project based on its best judgment about who would succeed there. To screen out people it did not expect to be successful, the provider usually unnecessarily added eligibility criteria other than those required by the project's funders. Coordinated entry, with the requirement that all vacancies be filled with referrals from its process, can mean that projects must enroll program participants who are more challenging to serve than before. Terry mentioned to me that a parallel side door to program referral causes a lot of misinformation and confusion among the Opportunity Council's clients, and invariably results in clients wanting to know why some people get fast-tracked into their programs ahead of others. She mentioned that they found that maintaining dual referral paths is counterproductive, and mentioned that's why Agape House left the system. She said she doesn't see the usefulness of participating in the coordinated entry program unless an agency is willing to follow what the system describes as best practices. Suffice it to say, I was very uncomfortable with relinquishing our application and enrollment process, and so I mentioned that we would be unwilling to do that for HomesNOW. Later in the meeting, Road to Home and LIHI answered questions. One of these questions was related to the cost to set up this new tiny home village and why LIHI was selected as partners when the price tag is so high. Tara Sundin answered that LIHI was selected because they had a paid staff model. Melissa Bird from Road to Home also mentioned that a village could not be operated safely in the neighborhood without paid staff.
We have, and I apologize if I mispronounced this, Banush. You're up next.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Hi.
Okay. So in this presentation, I did not hear anything about the cost of running this village. So that is a concern to me as a resident of Bellingham. And then the second question is, with HomesNOW having been a successful local nonprofit organization that has been running two locations in Bellingham, one at no cost and one at a low cost, why are we going to bring a company who's in the business of running these villages, and they're in the business of making money, not to end homelessness, into Bellingham? So why wasn't this offered to HomesNOW? If you could answer the question.
Okay, we will answer your questions. There were a couple in there. First of all, this village is going to cost a little over $500,000 for the construction of it. And that includes all of the supplies necessary, the kitchen, the hygiene trailer, electricity, all of that. And it's going to cost a little over $500,000 to operate it. So for those shelters do cost anywhere from about $500,000 and upwards to $1 million, depending on the size of them, to operate if they are operated under a model where you're paying staff to operate them. So for example, last winter, we hired the Opportunity Council to operate a winter shelter for the city. And we also hired Northwest Youth Services to operate a winter shelter for the city. So those two combined were about $55,000 a month on average, and those were nighttime only shelters. So just to give you a sense of that, I am not as familiar as HomesNOW. HomesNOW did also submit a statement of qualifications, and the panel that reviewed the qualifications selected LIHI and Road to Home partnership because of the model that they have. So it is a bit different, but we are paying for a different model. We are paying for a staffed model, a model that has case management on staff. Does anybody else, I'm sure LIHI would like to respond, and then Rick, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add about HomesNOW.
I just wanted to say one thing, Melissa.
Yeah.
So I understand that's a lot of money, my goodness. And I'm also a taxpayer, but I'm also a human being who's running a nonprofit, and I can't run this safely in your neighborhood and continue to work and raise my family. That's not, I need someone to do this. And so in order for us to do this, we need to pay qualified individuals to do this work so that we can take on clientele that really need our services and do that in a very safe manner for you, for them, for us, for everybody.
I would just like to make the argument that HomesNOW is currently operating 2 tiny home communities in Bellingham. One of them in the same neighborhood that Gardenview Village is going to be set up in, and both locations are very safe. And we haven't needed paid staff to keep the villages safe. We know it's possible because it's already happening. There's nothing inherently wrong with some paid staff in a different model than what we do, but the part I take issue with is that the village won't be safe if it doesn't have paid staff. I totally disagree with that. Planning Director Rick Sepler did chime in and followed up to say that there is no one-size-fits-all solution and that we need to have a variety of models.
If I could follow on, it's Rick Sepler. There's not one size fits all on this, and we needed a variety of approaches. This approach was felt by the review panel and by the city at the end run as offering a good opportunity with a proven record of placement. HomesNOW is succeeding. They've placed people in homes. It's a different kind of program, and it might suit a different group of people. We need as many different approaches as we can develop safely.
I agree with him on this point. After Rick's comment, Debbie Chantrell, the lead community ally for Road to Home, said that in her experience, allowing residents to run their own village takes away their ability to focus on their own lives and prevents them from moving forward. Debbie even mentioned that this was the reason for starting Road to Home in the first place.
Can I add something quickly? This is Debbie. I'm the lead community ally for Road to Home. I think to have the residents run the village takes time away from their ability to move forward in their own lives. That's my experience. And that's why we started Road to Home. Getting your life back together and finding permanent housing is a full-time job. And if you have to take shifts running the camp and doing the welcome desk and being available 24/7 to run the village, it doesn't give you much extra time to work on your own life.
First of all, I'd really like to say that I totally disagree with Debbie's argument. Helping in a staff capacity at the village is 100% volunteer. Residents are not required to be helping in a staff capacity. They volunteer to help and they do a good job. It's more empowering to be able to run the place that you live at rather than having an outside volunteer or outside staff member running things for you. Without villagers having a say in operations that they have to live under, it prevents them from becoming independent and working through their own problems together. Also, in regards to resident staff, we have multiple residents who are a point of contact. The point of contact is available 24/7, but it's not one person doing it, and it doesn't take up many hours of their life to dedicate to other tasks. That's why we have multiple resident managers and multiple points of contact, so that it's not just riding on one person's shoulders. Not to mention that in the future, if there are going to be more villages, that under the paid staff model of $1 million per year, you'd have to scale up financial capital in accordance with that, which will end up quickly becoming a drain on the taxpayers. Also, finding housing is only a full-time job because there's literally not enough available units for people. You've got 1,000 people who need housing, and you have only 50 units available. So it's a full-time job every day because you have to roll the dice and hope that you get into one of those 50 slots when there's a mountain of people waiting to get in. We might as well rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic. Like, seriously. In case there are those who are not aware, many of the core group of Road to Home previously volunteered with HomesNOW extensively. There were serious disagreements, however, about which direction to take the organization shortly after the construction of Unity Village. One of the biggest criticisms of how we ran things after Jim was removed from HomesNOW was that we were making life too comfortable at the village, that we were not doing a paid staff model, that we were not taking government money, among other issues. This caused a split, and we ended up going our separate ways. Road to Home has now subsequently linked up with LIHI, who is a very large organization, the equivalent of big business for homeless shelters. While LIHI is technically classified as a nonprofit, there are individuals who profit greatly from operating it. Sharon Lee, for example, is LIHI's executive director, and she makes over $200,000 a year. That's enough to construct 2 full tiny home villages per year for one person's pay. So while not technically classified as a business, I can see why some people would perceive it as such. A problem with many nonprofits, too, is that too much of their funding goes to paid staff and not on the actual goal that they're trying to accomplish. This leads to financial bloat, where like a lot of money is spent for what seems like a small thing. Later in the meeting, Teresa Homan from LIHI made her case as to why a resident-managed approach doesn't work. She echoed the issues that Debbie and Melissa had previously mentioned about how people at the village get too comfortable. She also mentioned that inherent issues arise with a resident-managed approach, such as abuse of power, inequity within the village, favoritism shown towards certain individuals, and individuals being exited unfairly.
Secondly, I would just add on and say the same thing you just heard, that we also tried self-managed villages and finally evolved into the model that is for us the most successful, partly because of a system of checks and balances, and everything is being measured, everything's being monitored, and that is simply for us to figure out the very best way to move as many people from homelessness to being housed. And so, you know, for us, we did find that people get complacent and get too comfortable in trying to live in the village, manage it themselves. Plus, there are inherent situations that can arise that create systems of the possibility of an abuse of power, inequity within the village, a favoritism shown toward certain individuals, other individuals being exited unfairly. And I am not saying that's the case with the other villages in Bellingham. I'm just speaking from LIHI's own experience.
I would like to mention that in any structure at all, whether you're talking about an employer or a tiny home village, whether you have paid staff or volunteer staff or resident staff, that includes involving, or the issues involving abuse of power, inequity, favoritism, and unfair exits can still occur. Just because somebody is paid does not mean they are immune to having those problems. We see similar scenarios at the workplace and in regards to politics and legal policy. The best way to prevent it is to have a system of checks and balances and to make sure that there's an open line of communication between everyone so that nobody can be in a position where they can abuse their authority. This is also one of the reasons why we have at least 3 resident managers to a site with equal standing, so that there's not one person who can override the others, and major decisions are made together as a village and they vote on it. Villages can even vote to change the management, which has occurred before with HomesNOW. Having the village make decisions together gives them a stake in the outcome of their village and how it operates. After being on the streets in a deeply uncomfortable position, why is it wrong to feel comfortable in your own home at a tiny home village? What's wrong with comfort? Why do we have to go out of our way to make life more difficult for people who have already been through enough just because we're trying to make them move along faster? Why can't they move at the pace that's right for them? In any case, things are going smoothly for HomesNOW with our 2 tiny home villages, Unity Village and Swift Haven, and our resident managed approach. Issues pop up from time to time, but we've always been able to handle it and get stronger as an organization as a result, working together. We're ready to do more and just trying to get people housed and increase the standard of living as much as possible without being a drain on the taxpayers. Have a great weekend, have fun, and good luck.